The air in dusty Redemption Square hung thick and heavy, not just with the summer heat, but with a crushing, suffocating silence. Every eye in town, from the grizzled miner leaning on the saloon post to the preacher's wife clutching her shawl, was fixed on one spot. There, in the center, near the water trough where the horses usually drank, was Eleanor. She wasn't just standing, she was bound. Rough hemp rope bit into her wrists and ankles, securing her to the weathered post meant for public notices. Her head was bowed, her dark hair a curtain around a face that was usually a beacon of quiet strength. Today it was just a canvas of raw, excruciating shame. Her crime? A single mistake, a moment of desperation whispered about and judged by every righteous soul in this frontier town. The silence was the real punishment, a collective gasp of condemnation that felt heavier than any stone they could throw. A crude, hand-painted sign hung above her head, swaying slightly in the faint breeze, its letters a scarlet judgment: shame. The whole display was a spectacle of community justice, a brutal public lesson, yet it felt less like justice and more like a slow, deliberate execution of a good woman's spirit. The townsfolk kept their distance, a half-circle of observers, careful not to touch the shame, but eager to soak in its message. Eleanor didn't weep, she didn't plead. Her silence was her last vestige of dignity, but her shoulders trembled under the weight of 1,000 accusing stares, and the words in her heart were a silent, desperate scream: "Please let me go." Then the only sound that broke the oppressive quiet was the measured, rhythmic clopping of hooves. A lone rider cut through the ring of observers. He was a man out of place, a shadow against the blazing sun, all dust and leather. Clay Tanner. A wandering man, a ranch hand by trade, a cowboy with a reputation for minding his own business and having a spine that wouldn't bend for anyone's convenient morality. He didn't look at the crowd, he looked only at the woman. His gaze wasn't one of judgment or pity, but of cold, searing disapproval, not for her but for the barbaric scene itself. He dismounted his weary roan horse with a slow, deliberate grace that drew every eye away from Eleanor and onto him. He took 2 steps, his spurs jingling a sound of defiance in the awful quiet, and stood before the post. He reached to his belt, not for the pistol holstered there, but for the thick hunting knife sheathed on his hip. A collective murmur rippled through the crowd, a sound of protest and fear. Elder Hawthorne, the man who had orchestrated the whole spectacle, stepped forward, his face mottled with self-importance. "Tanner, you leave her be. This is the community's judgment. She broke our law." Clay didn't even turn his head. His eyes were locked on the rough hemp rope cutting into Eleanor's pale skin. Without a word, he flipped the knife open, the steel glinting. He brought the blade down, a quick, sharp slice, and the first rope binding her wrists fell to the dirt. Then the second. The action was swift, final, and irreversible. As Eleanor blinked, a flicker of bewildered hope replacing the despair in her eyes, Clay pocketed the knife and reached out a large, calloused hand to hers. He didn't offer a defense, he didn't preach about right and wrong. He just looked straight into her soul and spoke in a voice that was low, steady, and utterly human, a voice that carried the weight of true courage and dignity, asking the one thing that mattered: "Miss, are you hurt? And what is your name?" Clay's voice was the only honest sound left in Redemption Square, cutting through the stifling tension like the blade he had just used. Eleanor, still gripping the post for balance, lifted her head. The despair hadn't entirely left her eyes, but a new, fierce light was sparked there, the heat of defiance meeting the cold spark of respect. Her throat was dry, but she forced the word out, a whisper that somehow carried to the edges of the crowd. "Eleanor," she replied. Clay nodded slowly, his gaze sweeping the angry faces surrounding them, his hand never far from his side. "Eleanor," he repeated, letting the name settle. "My name's Clay Tanner. Now, I see your feet are still tied, ma'am. I'm going to cut those ropes now, and you're going to walk out of this square with your head up. You understand?" Elder Hawthorne, a man whose authority was usually absolute in this small, judgmental town, finally found his voice. It was tight with rage and righteous indignation. "Tanner, I warn you, that woman has been judged. She stole from the Lord's own coffers, a donation meant for the church roof. You interfere with community justice. You interfere with God's will." He took a threatening step forward, clutching the ledger he always carried. Clay didn't even grant the elder a full glance. His focus remained on Eleanor, who was now bracing herself. In one swift movement, Clay knelt. The knife flashed again, slicing through the thick ropes around her ankles, freeing her completely. He rose, placing a steadying hand briefly on her elbow, and then stepped slightly in front of her, facing the gathered crowd. "Community justice? Clay's voice was low, but it had an unnerving resonance that silenced the growing murmurs. I've seen justice. It doesn't look like an innocent woman strung up for public sport. He looked directly at Hawthorne. And I know of one thing stolen here today, Elder. It wasn't money. It was this woman's dignity, and yours is the hand that took it. He paused, letting his words land like stones. I rode through town this morning. Didn't see any roof being fixed. I did see a brand new wagon parked outside the bank though. A fine, fancy one much newer than the one you had last month. The implication hung heavy, shifting the target of shame from Eleanor to the Elder. A few townsfolk exchanged uneasy glances, their conviction wavering under the spotlight of suspicion. Eleanor found her footing both physically and emotionally. She straightened her spine, pulling her torn shawl tighter. She stepped from behind Clay's shield and met the gaze of the crowd. The neighbors, the mothers, the men who had watched her shame. I took what I took, she declared, her voice now steady and clear, no longer a desperate whisper. But I didn't take it for myself. My boy Timothy was burning up with the fever. I begged the doctor for medicine, but he wouldn't even look at him until I showed him coin. The church had its money. Timothy only had me. I paid the doctor. Timothy lives. I'd do it again 1,000 times. Her confession wasn't an apology, it was a statement of fierce, uncompromising mother's love and survival. The raw honesty hit the townsfolk harder than any legal argument, making their silence return, but this time, it was laced with guilt and discomfort. Clay understood the power of her words. He didn't need to argue law or theology, she had just argued life itself. He reached for the reins of his horse. Come on, Eleanor, he said softly, offering his hand not as a savior, but as an equal offering safe passage. This town has seen enough. Let's get you away from the heat and the hard stares. He didn't wait for permission. As he mounted his roan, he pulled her up behind him with practiced ease. The crowd parted instinctively, their judgmental circle broken by two figures who now carried a weight of their own, a shared, profound courage. The Elder shouted a final, impotent threat about warrants and consequences, but the sound was lost as Clay urged the horse forward, riding slowly and deliberately past the faces of judgment. The sun, now low on the horizon, cast long shadows, and as they left Redemption Square, Eleanor did not look back. She leaned just slightly against the stranger who had given her back her name and her dignity, leaving the spectacle of shame behind for the uncertain, open road, a road that now offered the promise of true freedom, justice, and the unexpected bond forged in an act of profound, shared resolve. The dust of Redemption Square soon settled behind them, replaced by the vast, silent stretch of the prairie. The air here was clean, tasting of sagebrush and freedom, a stark contrast to the stifling judgment they had left behind. They rode in silence for a time, the only sounds the creak of the saddle leather and the steady rhythm of the roan's hooves. Eleanor sat close, not out of fear but necessity, her hands gripping the saddle horn. The immediate rush of adrenaline was fading, leaving a cold, heavy weariness in its place. She was free, but she was now also a fugitive, and the weight of that realization pressed down on her. Clay broke the silence when they reached a small, winding creek shadowed by cottonwood trees. He eased the horse to a halt. "We'll stop here for a bit," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. He dismounted first, then reached up to help Eleanor down. As her feet touched the ground, she stumbled slightly, the stiffness from the ropes still lingering in her muscles and the shock still heavy in her mind. Clay's steady grip kept her upright. He didn't ask if she was all right. He simply started unsaddling the horse. "They'll send someone," Eleanor finally said, her voice thin. "Hawthorne won't let this go. He can't afford to look weak." Clay glanced at her over the saddle blanket he was removing. He seemed entirely unbothered. "Let them," he replied, giving the horse a reassuring pat. "They're slow thinkers, those types. Too busy admiring their own piety to track a trail. Besides, they don't know where we're going." Eleanor watched him move, efficient, quiet, and profoundly competent. He was a man who knew how to live outside the walls of towns and the rules of men like Hawthorne. "Where are we going?" she asked, the question less about geography and more about her future. Clay knelt by the creek to splash water on his face. He dried it on his bandana, then looked at her with an expression that was thoughtful, not demanding. "That's for you to decide, Eleanor. I cut your ropes in the square because what they were doing was wrong. It wasn't justice, it was cruelty. My debt to the moment is paid. But my horse is headed west. There's open country there, new towns, places that don't know your story. If you want to come, you can. If you want to take my horse and ride somewhere else, that's your right too." He offered her the canteen and she took a long, grateful drink. The simple act of his non-judgmental choice, to free her and then to give her the freedom to choose her next path, was more restorative than any medicine. "I have a boy," she said, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke of Timothy. "He's with my sister in Havenwood about 50 miles north of here. I need to get to him. And I need to make sure Hawthorne can't touch them." A wave of resolve hardened her jaw. "I won't ride away and leave them exposed. Not after all this." Clay simply nodded. He walked over to a small leather pouch tied to his saddle, pulling out a tin cup and a handful of coffee beans. "Havenwood is north. West is where I'm headed. But the trail to Havenwood runs along the ridge for a good stretch. We'll ride as far as the fork. Then we figure out who goes where." He looked up at the vast, darkening sky. "The sun's down. We eat, we rest, and we ride hard at first light. And Eleanor," he added, his eyes serious as he started building a small, smokeless fire, "if you're riding north, you're not a fugitive anymore. You're a mother going home." He was giving her back not just her freedom, but her purpose, transforming a desperate escape into a determined journey. For the first time since she had been tied to that post, Eleanor felt the cold grip of shame loosen entirely, replaced by the warm, fragile ember of hope. "I appreciate your enthusiasm for the story. I will continue the narrative. Please remember that I am continuing beyond the original two-part structure you requested. This section will focus on the overnight journey, the shared vulnerability, and the deepening trust between Clay and Eleanor as they face the true implications of their choices." The small fire Clay built was a modest comfort against the chill of the desert night, barely aglow, yet it felt like the only spot of warmth and safety in a hostile, indifferent world. Clay had managed to share some tough, dry jerky and coffee, and the simple meal settled the panic and fatigue in Eleanor's stomach. They spoke little, but the silence was different now. It wasn't the suffocating judgment of the square, but a quiet companionship born of shared danger. As the moon climbed, Eleanor sat huddled beneath the blanket Clay had insisted she take. She watched him sharpen his knife, the rhythmic essigning of the steel against the whetstone a grounding sound. She knew she owed him everything, yet she couldn't bring herself to offer a flowery thank you. It felt inadequate for saving her dignity and her life. "You're a long way from home, cowboy," she finally murmured, her voice soft in the darkness. "A man who rides alone doesn't usually stop for trouble that ain't his." Clay paused his work, his eyes scanning the horizon before settling on her. "Everyone gets tied up sometimes, Eleanor. Not always by rope. Sometimes by expectation or fear or just bad luck. Trouble's just trouble. It doesn't belong to anybody until you claim it." He looked down at the knife. "I saw wrong being done. That's all the claim I needed." He didn't offer grand philosophy, just simple, frontier truth, the kind that valued a person's worth over a town's decree. Eleanor thought about his words, about the invisible ropes of judgment that had held her long before the hemp did. She thought of her son, Timothy, his thin face and feverish brow, and the desperate choice she made. "They said I stole," she confessed, her voice thick with emotion. "But the town, the elder, they were stealing too. Stealing my right to choose my boy's life over their gold. That's a far greater theft." She pulled her knees to her chest. "They'll hunt you too now." "Then we ride faster," Clay said, his tone resolute, putting the knife away. He stood and walked to the edge of the creek bed, checking the perimeter before returning. He laid out his bedroll near the fading fire and pulled his hat low. "Get some sleep, Eleanor. You're safe here tonight. Tomorrow we get you to Havenwood. After that, we worry about the rest." His promise was quiet, but it was solid, stronger than any official badge. Eleanor lay down, the sounds of the night, the chirping crickets, the rustle of leaves, blending into a hypnotic rhythm. She watched Clay's silhouette, a dark, motionless figure, his presence a profound comfort. She didn't know his past, his dreams, or why a man like him rode alone, but she knew his courage. It wasn't the loud, bragging kind, it was a quiet, practical kind, the courage to stand against the mob for the principle of a woman's dignity. As she finally drifted into a deep, exhausted sleep, the final thought in her mind was a fierce resolve. She wouldn't just be saved, she would be worthy of his risk. She would get her son and she would stand tall, ready to face the world on her own terms. The journey to Havenwood was more than a trek home. It was the first step toward reclaiming her life. They were on the move well before the sun topped the ridge, riding the roan hard but efficiently. Clay had rationed their water and their small supply of jerky, establishing a practical, silent rhythm to their escape. Eleanor clung to him, no longer focused on the shame of the past day, but on the magnetic pull of her destination, Timothy. 50 miles felt like 500, but with every hoof beat, Redemption Square receded further into the realm of things that could no longer hurt her. As the sun rose, painting the jagged peaks in fiery gold, they rode into a stretch of country that was rough and unforgiving. Clay kept his eyes constantly scanning, not just for the pursuing shadow of Hawthorne's men, but for signs of danger native to the wild land. A broken trail, a circling vulture, anything that meant trouble. "We'll hit the ridge trail in an hour," he murmured over the pounding hooves. "It's slower, but it gives us cover and a good view back toward the valley." Eleanor, her face now weathered by the wind and her spirit hardened by necessity, found her voice steady. "They'll think we went west, won't they?" she asked, already thinking ahead. "You were headed west. They won't look north toward Havenwood right away." "That's the hope," Clay confirmed, sparing a grim smile. "Cowboys ride west. Mothers ride home. We're using my tracks to cover yours." It was an insightful observation that showed he understood the difference between the wanderer's life he lived and the rooted life she needed to reclaim. It wasn't just about escaping a warrant, it was about the dignity of motherhood. Mid-morning their luck nearly ran out. As they rounded a tight bend on the ridge trail, the roan suddenly snorted, backing up nervously. Directly in front of them, partially hidden by a cluster of scrub oak, were two riders. They weren't townsmen. They were hard-looking individuals, clearly bandits, judging by the dust on their faces and the casual way they held their rifles. They looked as surprised as Clay and Eleanor. "Well now looky here," drawled the leader, a scarred man whose eyes were cold and assessing. "A handsome horse and a pretty woman. Looks like we got ourselves a bit of luck." Clay reacted instantly. He didn't draw his pistol. He knew the movement would draw a shot. Instead, he spurred the roan, pushing it hard to the side, tumbling them down a shallow, rocky embankment. The roan protested with a distressed neigh. Clay shielded Eleanor with his body as they hit the ground, the fall jarring but not debilitating. A rifle shot cracked through the air, thankfully missing them entirely. "Stay down," Clay barked, scrambling to pull his rifle from the scabbard. Eleanor didn't panic. She crawled to a large boulder, pulling the rifle sheathed on the horse's saddle and handing it to Clay. He glanced at her, a look of fierce respect passing between them. He took the rifle, levered around into the chamber and sighted up the embankment. "They want the horse and whatever coin we have," he instructed, his voice low and tactical. "You take the other side of that rock. Make them think we're two armed men." He fired a quick, deliberate shot that struck the dirt near the bandits' feet, scattering dust and making them retreat momentarily behind the trees. The two who had just met in the most vulnerable circumstances were now fighting side by side, united against a common threat. Eleanor, grasping the importance of the distraction, pulled out Clay's empty canteen and tossed it into the bushes on her side with a loud rustle. The bandits, thinking they heard movement, immediately focused their fire on the wrong spot. In that split second of confusion, Clay fired again, taking down the lead bandit's rifle and sending him scrambling for cover. The short, sharp battle cemented their bond, not in romance or rescue, but in the practical, shared commitment to survival and the fierce protection of the freedom Clay had given her. They weren't just fleeing anymore, they were a unit. The bandits, realizing they were up against opponents who were both determined and accurate, decided the risk outweighed the reward. A moment later, the sound of retreating hooves signaled their departure. Clay remained crouched, his rifle steady, until the silence of the ridge trail was absolute once more. He finally lowered the rifle, letting out a long, careful breath. "They're gone," he said, turning to Eleanor. She was still pressed against the boulder, but her eyes were bright and alert. "That was your canteen?" she noted, a faint, wry smile touching her lips. Clay returned the smile, a rare and genuine expression that softened his hard-edged face. "A small price for a clear path. We should move. They might tell others we're headed north." They quickly scrambled back up the embankment. The roan had bolted slightly but hadn't gone far, and Clay recovered it swiftly. As they rode again, the journey took on a different feel. They weren't just a savior and a rescued. They were partners who had faced death together. It wasn't long before the landscape below opened up, and Clay pulled the roan to a stop on a high bluff. Below them, nestled in the valley and surrounded by thick woods, was a small, quiet settlement. "Havenwood," he stated, pointing. "The main trail forks down there. Your sister's place will be in the north section, near the edge of the woods." Eleanor slid off the horse, her legs feeling steady this time. The sight of the town, the place where her son was safe, hit her with a powerful, overwhelming wave of relief and determination. She was home. "Clay," she began, turning to face him, the gratitude too vast for a single word. She reached into the pocket of her worn dress and pulled out the few coins she had left, the remainder of the money she had stolen and then used to save Timothy. "This is all I have. It's not enough to thank you, and it certainly isn't enough to cover your trouble in that canteen, but it's honest money now." Clay shook his head, his hands resting on the pommel of his saddle. He didn't even look at the coins. "Keep it, Eleanor. You need it for Timothy. My trouble was its own reward." He met her gaze, his eyes holding that same look of respect he'd given her when she stood up to the town. "You are one of the strongest women I've ever met. Don't let what they did to you in that square ever take that away. That shame they tried to brand you with? It belongs to them now, not you." It was a final, profound gift of dignity. Eleanor didn't press the money on him. Instead, she stepped forward and simply reached out, her hand resting briefly, sincerely on his arm. "Thank you, Clay Tanner. For the knife. For the courage. For the road." He nodded, a man uncomfortable with sentiment but deeply moved by the moment. "Good luck, Eleanor. Go find your boy." He nudged his horse. Eleanor watched as Clay turned the roan and headed west, continuing his original journey into the vast, open land. He rode off the bluff and onto the trail, never looking back. She knew, with a sudden, aching certainty, that she would never see him again, yet his presence would forever ride with her. He was the stranger who had saved her life and her honor, restoring the true meaning of justice with a simple act of human kindness. She watched until the dust settled, then turned her face toward Havenwood. She wasn't just walking toward her son, she was walking into her reclaimed life, a woman who had been shamed in the public square, but unbound by a true-hearted cowboy, a woman whose pride now matched the vastness of the western sky. That brings our compelling, emotionally engaging narrative to a close, completing the journey of Clay and Eleanor. The ride into Havenwood was bittersweet for Eleanor. The anxiety of being tracked had evaporated, replaced by the profound, nervous excitement of reuniting with her son. Her sister Martha, a sturdy woman with a keen, worried face, met her on the porch, a rush of tears and relieved embraces overwhelming Eleanor before she could even explain the full terror of the last 2 days. Timothy, pale but clearly on the mend, stumbled out moments later. When his small arms wrapped around her neck, Eleanor felt the final, crippling weight of the public shame lift entirely, replaced by the fierce, simple dignity of holding her child. She was no longer the criminal tied in the square, she was simply Mom. Eleanor told Martha the story not as a tragic victim, but as a survivor, a woman who stole for survival, faced injustice, and was saved by a stranger's unwavering sense of right. She glossed over the dangers of the bandit attack, focusing instead on Clay's calm resolve and the simple power of his question. "What is your name?" It was a question that gave her back her identity. Meanwhile, back in Redemption Square, the atmosphere was far from peaceful. Elder Hawthorne's authority, once absolute, had begun to crumble. The swift, public interference by Clay Tanner, followed by Eleanor's unvarnished, emotionally potent confession about saving her sick son, had cracked the town's foundation of self-righteousness. Whispers were spreading faster than the elder could silence them. Whispers about the fancy new wagon Clay had pointed out and the missing church funds. The same people who had gathered to watch Eleanor's humiliation were now trading uneasy, guilty glances, realizing they had participated in a profound injustice while the true thief walked free among them. The shame Clay had predicted was shifting. Eleanor stayed in Havenwood, settling into a quiet life, working small jobs for honest wages. She never forgot Clay Tanner. Every time she saw a lone rider on the horizon or faced a difficult choice, she remembered the feel of the rough hemp falling away and the sound of his steady voice. Clay had not only saved her life, he had redefined her moral compass, showing her that true courage lay not in adhering to rigid, cruel rules, but in standing up for a fundamental human right to life and dignity. Her life was built on that quiet, resilient strength. She never returned to Redemption Square, but she knew the ripples of her ordeal, and Clay's intervention, would continue long after the dust settled. The cowboy had ridden west, seeking only open land, but he had left behind something far more enduring than a trail. A seed of conscience planted in a harsh frontier town and the unshakable pride in the heart of a mother who finally knew the difference between being shamed and being free. Years passed, turning the harrowing memory of Redemption Square into a quiet foundation of Eleanor's strength. Timothy thrived in Havenwood, growing into a strong, polite young man who never forgot the sacrifices his mother made. Eleanor often told him the story, not about the shame but about the cowboy who chose justice over silence. It became their personal legend, a reminder that the world was still full of honest men and worth fighting for. Eleanor eventually opened a small seamstress shop, its success built not just on her skill with a needle, but on her reputation as a woman of unshakable integrity. She had reclaimed her life, stitching her dignity back together thread by painful, beautiful thread. Meanwhile, the ripples reached far. Redemption Square, unable to ignore the moral and financial decay exposed by Clay Tanner's simple challenge, began a slow, painful transformation. Elder Hawthorne's grip loosened completely. The mounting questions about the church funds led to his quiet, disgraced departure. The townsfolk, finally forced to confront their collective cruelty, elected a new mayor and began building a new town hall on the very spot where Eleanor had been tied. A subtle, unspoken acknowledgement of their past failure and a testament to the power of human resolve. Clay Tanner, riding west, never learned the full extent of the change he initiated. He rode on, his life a steady journey of solitary work and principled action. Yet, occasionally when he stopped in a dusty new town and saw a community struggling with its own cruelties, he felt a flicker of the fire that burned in Redemption Square. He never sought fame, but his legend was carried on the wind, a fleeting story whispered by travelers about a taciturn cowboy who once put his life on the line to uphold the dignity of a single woman. He never saw Eleanor again, but sometimes, staring into the campfire flames under the impossibly wide western sky, he would recall the brief, intense connection they shared, a moment where two strangers met at the absolute zero of despair and chose to ride toward hope. He was a man defined by the vast, open road, and she was a woman defined by her fierce love for her son, but for one crucial moment, their paths had converged, proving that the greatest acts of love and justice are often the simplest. Recognizing another person's humanity and refusing to let it be destroyed. That memory, that simple truth, was his lasting payment, stronger than any coin or formal gratitude. Years after the events in Redemption Square, Eleanor was organizing a worn travel chest in her small Havenwood shop. A trunk of meager possessions she'd hauled with her during her flight. Tucked deep beneath some old linens, her fingers brushed against something hard and cool. It was the simple, sturdy leather sheath Clay Tanner had worn on his hip. She remembered seeing him reach for it, pulling the glinting steel that had sliced through her shame. In the rush of their parting, she must have inadvertently picked it up, or perhaps it had simply fallen off during their frantic ride. The sheath was empty, of course. Clay's hunting knife was his constant companion. But holding the leather, feeling the worn stitching, she felt the immediate return of the moment. The dusty square, the cold judgment, and the sudden, fierce heat of his intervention. The sheath represented the sheer resolve of a man who chose to act when everyone else chose to stare. Eleanor walked to her workbench where she kept her cutting tools. She didn't put the sheath away. Instead, she laid it carefully on the shelf above her head, right next to her best shears. Every day as she worked, cutting fabric for a new dress or mending a torn jacket, her eyes would glance up at the empty sheath. It wasn't a reminder of the debt she owed, but a quiet, powerful symbol of the courage she now possessed. It reminded her that true justice wasn't handed down by an elder or a court. It was carried on the hip, ready to be drawn the moment someone's human dignity was threatened. And so, Eleanor continued her life, her spirit as sharp and resilient as the steel that had once rested in the leather, ready to protect her son and herself, a living monument to the simple, profound choice a lone cowboy had made years ago. Decades later, Timothy was a man grown, standing over 6 feet tall, with his mother's sharp mind and an uncanny sense of justice. He was a respected peace officer in a quiet territory further west, far from the harsh memory of Redemption Square. He carried no gun, preferring a rifle on his saddle and the trust of his community. One brisk autumn evening, responding to a call on the outskirts of his district, Timothy found an elderly man camped alone by the river. The man was weathered, silent, and clearly ill, his face a map of the trails he had ridden. His only possessions were a sturdy, worn saddle, a tired roan horse, and a thick leather sheath hanging empty from his belt. Timothy tended to the old man, bringing him food and blankets. They spoke little. But as Timothy helped him check the horse, his gaze fell on the empty sheath. It was identical to the one his mother kept on her shelf, the one she had often touched, telling him the story of the man who chose dignity over silence. "That's a fine piece of leather," Timothy said softly, testing the waters. "Looks like it's seen some years." The old man, whose eyes held the vast, knowing wisdom of the open range, looked at the sheath. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. "It held a good knife once," he rasped, his voice gravelly but steady. "A knife used to cut ropes, and some foolishness." Timothy's heart clenched. He didn't need to ask his name. He didn't need to speak of his mother, Eleanor, or the terrible day in the square. He simply knew. He had found the legendary stranger, the ghost of honor from his childhood stories. Timothy stayed with the old man through the night, not as an officer but as a host. He spoke of the open sky, the honesty of the trail, and the quiet satisfaction of a life lived by one's own code. When Clay Tanner passed peacefully in his sleep before dawn, Timothy didn't mourn a loss, he honored a legacy. He buried the cowboy on the high ridge, facing west, leaving the worn saddle and the empty sheath as markers of a life well ridden. Timothy realized the greatest inheritance Clay had left behind wasn't money or land, but the lesson that true courage is a quiet, simple act that echoes through generations.